Welcome back to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. In the Russian war in Ukraine, things do seem to be escalating again, perhaps stung by some battlefield retreats. Vladimir Putin's Russian forces have fired dozens of missiles at Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. The death toll in these areas seems to be going up. And here to talk about the latest developments is Medea Benjamin. She's the author of The War in Ukraine, How to Make Sense of a Senseless War. Medea, where are we in this conflict? Is it a sensitive escalation inflection point, as some people suggest, or is this just sort of another step in a long, arduous war?
Who knows? What we see is that every escalation brings on an escalation from the other side. When it was the Russian referenda annexing 4 provinces, then leading to the blowing up of the bridge that led to these recent attacks. It's a constant escalation, and I don't think anybody knows where this is leading. That's why it's such a grave concern, because each side is hardening its position, and we don't even know what the end goal of the United States is at this point.
President Biden said that Vladimir Putin is a rational actor. That's sort of a political science kind of term, but it suggests that there's nothing necessarily irrational the Biden administration might expect from Vladimir Putin. Irrational perhaps being indiscriminate use of tactical nuclear weapons. Do you agree with that analysis of President Putin?
I don't think that the invasion itself was a rational act. I think it was a tremendous mistake if it was even thought about in a very rational way. But I do think that those who feel that Putin is irrational should be even more concerned about the use of nuclear weapons, which should make them even more determined to have a serious shot at negotiations. And for those who think that Putin is rational, then there is also the call for finding ways to sit down together. I wish that Anthony Blinken and Lavrov would be communicating with each other every week, every day, constantly. I think that the fact that Blinken is not talking to his counterpart in Russia is a terrible thing. I think the US is not supporting negotiations, but wants to see Russia truly weakened by this. And I think that's where we get the comments that the president said about the possibility of a nuclear war.
Yeah, Vladimir Putin said that he's not kidding when he's talking about all options being on the table for him. Do you see a particular scenario, and obviously this is sort of a worst case scenario, but that triggers Vladimir Putin to go ahead and use tactical nuclear weapons? Is it, as some people have suggested, okay, his forces have to go in full retreat and Vladimir Putin uses a tactical nuclear weapon to try to destroy huge swaths of a battlefield? Is that how this develops, or do you see something short of that?
I see that when there is no off-ramp, that the possibility of nuclear weapon becomes more and more on the horizon. And I see that people like the former chief of staff, Mike Mullen, when he talks about the need for a negotiated solution, I think he is thinking of the catastrophic possibility. And of course, if Russia did use a nuclear weapon, we have no idea how the US would respond, but we know that it would be a huge escalation. So I would not rule out the nuclear possibility, but I think that as we move forward with this refusal to be serious about negotiations, and perhaps giving Zelensky the idea that it is realistic that Ukraine could join NATO, could get back every inch of territory that the Russians have taken since 2014, that's just not realistic. And having unrealistic expectations makes this conflict more and more dangerous.
Yeah, and it does seem as if the United States has set a certain number of unrealistic or raising expectations for what Ukraine could possibly do in some sort of victory. What do you see as being reasonable, and putting aside, any feelings that any of us may have about Russia or Ukraine? What is a sort of a reasonable, or would you say manageable, negotiated end to this, and what would that look like?
I think for the Donbass, it would look very much like the Minsk agreements looked like. And it would have to be adhered to, not just having the monitors there, and perhaps there has to be peacekeepers there, not just monitors. But there also has to be the political side that was never implemented, which means a certain degree of autonomy for that region. I think it means that Ukraine would be neutral. I don't see any way getting out of this in which Ukraine would be a member of NATO. But let's remember, even as Zelensky himself said, with the Western forces supplying the weaponry, supplying the intelligence, training the Ukrainians, it is really a de facto, if not de jure, member of NATO. And I think that will have to change. We have to take into account Russia's security needs if there is going to be a compromise that Russia will agree to.
Is there that sort of compromise in terms of the Ukrainians that Zelensky can embrace and still survive politically, or is the domestic pressure that much greater on him to be part of NATO, to not accept any sort of negotiated settlement?
Well, that's a good question, because we know that Zelensky earlier on, back in March, early April, when the negotiations were going on in Turkey, was totally open for Ukraine being a neutral country, said that we would have to give up of the dreams of joining NATO. And now his tune is very different. And certainly he faced backlash from the more extreme nationalists in Ukraine when he said that. And I think it will be tough for him to go back. But that's what negotiations are all about. You have to make compromises on all sides. And that's where I go back to the US role, because I think when the US said that when both Boris Johnson went to meet with Zelensky, and then Secretary of Defense Austin went to meet and said that this was going to be a war to weaken Russia, and when Boris Johnson said that we would keep supplying these weapons till the victory, I think that gave Zelensky much more of a political platform to then be saying that he was not going to accept these kind of compromises. If the U.S. said to Zelensky, there is a limit to the number of amount of weapons that we could send, we are starting to face opposition domestically for this. And if the US started talking to the Russians, I think we'd see a very different scenario.
In a lot of Western capitals, there seems to be this hope, this dream that Vladimir Putin either suddenly gets overthrown, there's some sort of coup, and that some new Russian leadership takes over and pulls all the troops out of Ukraine. Is that a pipe dream?
Well, it is, and I think we've seen some recent accounting that says that if indeed that happened, and it's very unlikely that it would happen, that there would be the chance of somebody even more extreme than Vladimir Putin taking charge. So it's one of those, be careful of what you wish for. We have seen that in other countries where the US has been involved militarily in overthrowing governments, and the result has not been pretty. So I think it's quite unlikely, and I think if it did happen, it might not be what we had hoped for.
A lot of people are hoping that the weather, because of the winter and how muddy the fields in Ukraine get, that maybe there's some sort of stalemate that comes for the next 5 or 6 months. Do you think that's a possibility, that both sides essentially get so entrenched that battle lines and positions don't change much for a while?
Well, I think that might be the case, but as winter comes, we're going to see a lot more opposition in Europe to this war. We're going to see a lot more suffering all over as a result of this. The consequences of the food scarcity will become even greater. The issues about the energy prices will become even greater. And so I think we're going to see a growing clamor throughout Europe, even in the United States and other parts, to say, we need to find a way out of this. We're already seeing at the United Nations during the General Assembly, small island nations saying, you've put more into Ukraine this year than you've put into the entire global climate fund that was supposed to help us deal with the catastrophes of the climate crisis. So I think there's going to be many reasons why this winter is going to be a very difficult one. And I'm hoping that it's one in which the pressure on all sides is going to lead to some kind of serious talks. We hear the Secretary General of the United Nations calling for that. We hear the Pope calling for that. And we're going to hear more and more leaders and grassroots people as we see protests happening throughout Europe now. It's going to become harder and harder to maintain these very, very divergent positions and drag this war on who knows how much longer.
Can the position of Vladimir Putin change much? In other words,
well, I think so. I think there is a lot of opposition that's getting through in Russia itself. We see it from so many people, young men of military age fleeing the country. We see it in more and more news getting through into Russia about how badly this is going for the Russians. I think there is tremendous pressure on Putin, and eventually that pressure is going to either lead to him escalating and doing something very horrific, like the nuclear weapons we talked about, or it's going to lead to a compromise.
Medea Benjamin, she's the co-founder of CODEPINK, Women for Peace, also the author of The War in Ukraine, How to Make Sense of a Senseless War. Medea, thanks so much for joining us. I hope the optimism that some of us have is not misplaced, and that at some point, sooner rather than later, there is some sort of off-ramp, there is some sort of talks and negotiations that can end this thing, because it seems like the suffering right now is only getting worse. Medea, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And my last word is we have to push the Democrats as well as the Republicans to be calling for negotiations so that we get something out of the White House that is not just constant sending of more weapons to Ukraine.
Well said. And that'll do it for this edition of The Conversation. On behalf of Gina Kim, Asher Cofield, John Skip Velacco, and the entire gang at the Young Turks, I'm David Schuster. Thanks for watching.